Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Daniel Murphy and I am assistant editor of the journal. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article in the current issue of the journal. Today's podcast features an interview with Dr. Matthew Hyland, visiting assistant professor of history at Duquesne University. In the interview, Dr. Hyland and I discuss his article titled The Florida Keys Hurricane House, Post-Disaster New Deal Housing, which was published in the fall 2012 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly. Here is our conversation.
Your article titled The Florida Keys Hurricane House, Post-Disaster New Deal Housing is scheduled to be published in the fall 2012 Florida Historical Quarterly. Can you briefly define Hurricane House and explain its significance in Florida during the 1930s?
Sure, be happy to. The Florida Hurricane House came about after the Labor Day 1935 hurricane that came across the Keys at Islamorada, and the Hurricane House is a joint effort, a response of both the federal government and the Red Cross to rebuild the community of Islamorada. It's a masonry building, 1 story tall, and it is made completely of reinforced poured concrete.
You kind of talked about its construction a bit there. What was unique about the architecture or construction of the Hurricane House at the time?
Well, first off, what's unique about the Hurricane House at the time is the reinforced poured concrete with the steel rebars and pouring concrete forms. That was rather innovative for the time. Not until, poured concrete comes about in early 1900 for industrial uses, and then you see it more and more in warehouses as you get through the 1920s. But in the 1930s, to use it in domestic architecture is rather innovative. So its materials are unique for that context of domestic architecture. But to help you visualize it, you have to imagine the entire house is built of reinforced concrete from the cisterns down in the ground level, which are innovative too. Typically, the cisterns the people in the Florida Keys had were, made of wood, and they were elevated on some sort of structure. Cedar planks would hold them together, and they'd collect the rainwater out there. But high winds had the effect of knocking them over, and there goes the stored potable water. So now with these hurricane houses, the basement features cisterns that store water that can help people after the storm. Now they have water they can drink. See, the exterior walls are about 12 inches thick of poured concrete and reinforced steel. The interior walls are also poured concrete, and they're quite thick too, about 10 inches. And they're also reinforced with steel rebar. And the roof, the gable roof, is even made of poured concrete reinforced with steel rebar. And what makes it even more interesting structurally is that the walls, the cistern, the roof make it into an integrated structure, and commentators of the day noted how that it tied the whole house together and made it highly wind resistant. And they're concrete, so they do have sort of an industrial look, but they did make some efforts to put some design elements on them. And if you look at closely at the front porch of some of these houses, they're interesting to look at, and so are the houses.
So the theme here is definitely concrete, then, I guess, with these houses.
Right. But we can't. Yeah, definitely the theme is concrete with these houses, the wind resistant houses. But we can't lose sight of the fact that during the effort to rebuild after the hurricane, they also rebuilt and repaired wooden houses. So that was part of the project too. So there's some wood frame houses that were also reconstructed, but it's the concrete ones that really catch your eye when you're driving through Islamorada.
Okay, well, shifting gears a little bit, in terms of their construction, and this is a big centerpiece of your article, I believe, how would you characterize the relationship of the federal government, state government, and Red Cross at the construction of these hurricane houses following the 1935 hurricane?
Yeah, that's a great question because right after the hurricane, everyone wanted to help. The devastation caused by the storm was front page news on the New York Times. Also, newspapers in Miami covered the event thoroughly. And the tragedy provoked people to, lend all the aid they could. Representatives of the federal government said they would spend unstintingly, and you have to remember this is, during the height of the Great Depression. And here's another hardship coming down on people in Monroe County, Florida, which was going through bankruptcy at the time too. And so initially, right after the storm, all sorts of agencies were ready to help. FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the state of Florida, and the Florida National Guard, and the Red Cross. And over time, they start to realize the extent of the devastation, and then the officials from each agency start rethinking how they can rebuild the community. And the federal government realizes that they may have promised too much with their statements in the early days of the disaster. So there's some federal agencies that say, well, we can't provide labor to work on private homes, and then the Red Cross realizes once the National Guard leaves that they're going to be the lead agency, if you will, responding to the disaster. At first, it seems like everyone, wants to help as much as they can, but then they realize there might be some constraints on where they can allocate resources. And so eventually, in the first phases of rebuilding, it's the Red Cross who takes the lead, and they become a little overwhelmed by the scope of the project, and then it looks like the federal government is backing away even more, and then the state really doesn't do much after the initial days of the storm and finding bodies and providing temporary shelter. So it's the Red Cross that emerged. They eventually find themselves overwhelmed by construction costs, especially with poured concrete and digging those continuous deep foundation trenches for the buildings. They're not just poured onto the top layer of the coral rock. They excavated footers deeply and throughout the whole footprint of the building. So costs rose, and eventually the Red Cross was relieved when FERA started providing more money for materials, and then eventually FERA, which is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, started to provide manpower too. So, which is to say, essentially, by the end of the project, FERA is supplying funds, labor, and management too, and the Red Cross is just overseeing the project. The Red Cross was, if you look in the records in the correspondence among Red Cross officials, they're always a little worried that at any moment the federal government might withdraw its funding, and they would have to take up the task of finishing the job. At the time, the Roosevelt administration was reorganizing federal relief agencies and changing program names, changing program mandates, moving from direct relief to work relief. And so even though the federal government and the Red Cross are working together on this, I would say the Red Cross was always a little cautious of what the federal government was promising. But in the end, it all worked out.
Well, to follow up with that, how did Floridians view this relationship? Did they see these groups working together as being effective, or were they unhappy with it, or can you even tell from your research how they viewed this?
There were people in Islamorada who really wanted to rebuild. They wanted to stay. However, some folks were advising that the whole Florida Keys, the Upper Keys, wherever the storm had damaged communities, ought to be abandoned. One representative of the National Guard, I believe, said it should be you just burn over the Keys and walk away from the Keys and all that destruction. The community was relieved and reassured when government agencies and the Red Cross promised to rebuild. And they were even excited and pleased to hear that they would be building homes that could withstand hurricanes, homes that would provide shelter during the storm and water storage for the days after the storm. And at one point, when funding sources were either going away or not quite full, or it looked like some funding might be withdrawn, people in Islamorada had a petition drive, and they made it clear that they wanted concrete homes built there so that they could maintain their community, and they had to make clear that this is what they wanted, and they wanted to stay there. And even though the project might be expensive, they wanted to see it to completion.
Well, based on your research, what are the legacies of hurricane houses and their development for the United States today?
Yeah, they do speak to legacy. They do the way that the hurricane homes have survived the insults of storms after 1935 really do let you know. And the story through architecture is that you can build for the ages with reinforced concrete. These communities in the Florida Keys can survive with the right type of domestic architecture and also other institutional architecture too. You see the importance of water storage. You see the importance of masonry construction, and the hurricane houses also show the need of elevating the living space 5 to 7 feet above ground level, depending on where you are in the Keys. And so if you take a look at the hurricane houses from 1935, and then as you go around and look at communities on Plantation Key and Upper Matacumbe, Lower Matacumbe, you see the idea getting the house raised as high off the coral rock. You see masonry construction, and typically it's concrete block. And you see low roof profiles, and you see other features that are designed to minimize wind damage. Cisterns became obsolete after the 1940s when a water main connected the Keys to the mainland and a continuous source of water in that way. So those are more of the physical aspects that can be seen as legacies. But furthermore, you can see in the hurricane homes a notion of how to revitalize communities when government agencies and charities rally their resources. And you can see a legacy in how experimental architecture or innovative architecture offers solutions to social problems. The houses also give clues as to how to maintain communities and how to have a cooperative responses to tragedies and hardships. So the houses speak not just to getting through the hurricane, but also getting through the Great Depression and other economic hardships.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to add about your article you'd like our audience to know?
These homes are still standing on the Keys in Islamorada. Most of them are on Upper Matacumbe or Plantation Key, and I would like listeners to be aware that the community of Islamorada is aware of the presence of these historic resources, and they're taking effort. They're making efforts to recognize the significance of the hurricane houses there, because when you drive through Islamorada, first you'll be driving on the Overseas Highway, which is also a legacy of the 1935 Labor Day hurricane, and then you'll also see as you go through Islamorada the Hurricane Memorial right there near the center of Islamorada. And if you are to look a little closer around on Islamorada, you'll see these homes, and I think it's worth knowing that they're still standing, and people are interested in the building's history.
Well, Dr. Hyland, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Oh, you're very welcome. I've enjoyed our conversation.
The music you have listened to in this podcast is from the group Sleeping Policemen. We featured their song Vogelbird at the top of the episode. Please look for them on the Free Music Archive and enjoy them again at the end of the episode. Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you would consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. In recognition of the upcoming quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513, the FHQ will publish a series of 6 special issues, each devoted to examining Florida over the previous 5 centuries. Beginning in 2013, a special issue will be published each consecutive year, with 2 in 2016, that provides an overview of current interpretations and evaluation of historiographic trends relevant to the period being covered. We look forward to receiving your feedback on these special issues and other future FHQ volumes as well. We also invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. If you enjoy listening to this podcast and know of others who enjoy history, please tell them about the podcast and have them find us on Facebook.